After her affair partner walked out, my ex-wife begged me to help raise their child. She never saw my response coming. You know that moment in The Godfather where Michael Corleone sees a stunning woman in Italy, and it's as if time stops. His bodyguards whisper about how he's been struck by the thunderbolt, that overwhelming feeling of instant, uncontrollable love. That kind of moment doesn't just exist in movies. I know because I saw it happen firsthand. Except it wasn't me who felt it. It was my wife. And it wasn't me she felt it for. The thunderbolt struck my wife 25 years into our marriage, and everything unraveled from there. My name is Greg, short for Alan Gregerson. I'm 50 years old, living in a small Midwestern city not far from Chicago. For most of my adult life, I've been a reliable accountant, content with the steady predictability of numbers and routines. My ex-wife, Tracy, was a third-grade teacher, and we raised one daughter together, Morgan. She's 25 now, married, with a little one of her own in Denver. From the outside looking in, our life together seemed like a success story. 26 years of marriage, a happy home, and a family built on trust, until it all fell apart. I met Tracy during my sophomore year at Iowa State University. She had just transferred into my dorm, and I first saw her lying on a towel outside, basking in the late summer sun. Blonde, confident, radiant. She was the kind of woman you couldn't help but notice. I was captivated instantly, as if struck by my own version of the thunderbolt. I even announced to my friends, half joking, that I was going to meet my future wife. When I approached her, she propped herself up, flashed me a smile, and teased me about blocking her sun. That teasing humor, that effortless charm, she had me wrapped around her finger from that moment on. Our connection was immediate. Tracy was everything I admired, sharp-witted, playful, and self-assured in a way that made her glow. She had been valedictorian in high school, a quiet overachiever with both beauty and brains. At the time, I thought I was shooting above my league, but she saw something in me. Within months, we were inseparable, and after graduation, we married. I became the steady provider, and she was the heart of our little family. When Morgan was born, life felt complete. For the next 2 decades, we lived what I thought was a fulfilling, happy life. Tracy poured herself into teaching, earning the love of her students and colleagues. I built a stable career, and we settled into the rhythm of marriage, date nights, family dinners, summer vacations. Our physical connection slowed as the years went by, especially after Morgan left for college, but we still found moments of intimacy. I was never the jealous type, but I'd noticed sometimes that others would glance at Tracy a little too long. She was beautiful. It was inevitable. Still, she always made me feel like I was the only one she truly saw. Then, 3 years ago, everything changed. It started at a neighborhood party. One of those typical summer gatherings where drinks flow, kids play, and everyone catches up on gossip. Tracy and I arrived together, splitting off as we always did to mingle. I didn't think much of it at first. She was chatting with friends across the yard, her face lit up with laughter, but then something caught her attention. A new group had arrived, and I watched as Tracy's gaze lingered on one man in particular. Her expression shifted, her focus sharpened, and for the first time in years, I saw something I couldn't quite place. Awe? Attraction? Whatever it wasn't something I recognized. I dismissed it at first. But the feeling lingered, that nagging gut instinct that something was wrong. Later, when I couldn't find her in the yard, I went looking. Inside the Harris's house, I found Tracy in the den with a group of people, for others, including the man she'd been staring at. His name, as I would later learn, was Charles Dillon, a European literature professor at the local college. He was French, effortlessly charming, and he had his arm resting on her hip. It was casual, too casual. Tracy laughed and brushed it off when I approached, her face flushing a shade of red I hadn't seen in years. That night marked a turning point, though I didn't realize it at the time. Over the following weeks, I noticed little changes in her. Tracy began mentioning Charles in passing conversation, a book he recommended, a story he told, a restaurant he'd raved about. At first, it was innocent enough. People talk about coworkers. But there was something in the way she spoke about him that unsettled me. Her tone carried a lightness, a spark that hadn't been there before. Slowly, other changes followed. Tracy started taking more care with her appearance. Longer runs, new makeup, clothes I hadn't seen her wear in years. She was staying late at school more often, texting more frequently with her phone turned face down when she set it on the table. If I asked who she was talking to, the answer was always vague. A coworker, a group chat. The connection between us began to fray. Tracy grew distant, emotionally and physically. Dinner conversations turned hollow. Nights on the couch felt strained. I'd reach for her hand and sense her pulling back, small, barely noticeable, but real. I told myself I was imagining things, that this was just a phase. But the gut feeling I'd had that night at the party kept growing stronger. Then came the moment I couldn't ignore. Tracy had been out late one evening, supposedly celebrating the end of the semester with colleagues. She returned home flushed, her smile bright and far away, like her mind was somewhere else. I watched her, searching for the woman I'd married, but I felt like I was looking at a stranger. I wanted to believe I was wrong, that nothing was happening. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the thunderbolt I'd felt all those years ago, the one that had brought me to Tracy, had found its way to her, too. Only this time it wasn't aimed at me. The unraveling of our marriage wasn't sudden, like a dramatic explosion. It was slow, like a thread being pulled loose until the fabric gave way. I'd see glimpses of her phone lighting up with messages she hid. I'd hear Charles's name drop into conversations with a little too much reverence. And one night, when her phone buzzed with a text that read, "Tonight was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you," I could no longer pretend. My marriage, the life I'd built for 25 years, was already gone. And I had no idea how to get it back. That summer night at the party marked the beginning of everything falling apart. Charles Dillon, a French literature professor from the local college, was the catalyst. I remember sizing him up at first glance, around 32, lean, scruffy, with that casual charm that somehow made him look both rugged and refined. It wasn't jealousy, not at first. I'm not the insecure type. Tracy was still beautiful and always had a way of attracting attention, but that night, something felt off. When I spotted Tracy on the sand volleyball court with Charles, I tried to push aside my unease. They were smiling, exchanging glances, and there were more touches than there should have been. Subtle things, a hand on her lower back, a brush of her arm, but enough to make my gut twist. I tried to shake it off, waving to her occasionally to keep up appearances. She'd wave back, her face flushed, and then return to her game like nothing was wrong. Later in the evening, I realized I couldn't see Tracy anywhere. The yard was full of people, drinks were flowing, but she was gone. That gnawing feeling in my stomach intensified. I joked with the guys on the court that my 47-year-old legs needed a beer, then casually stepped off the game and wandered into the house. I searched room after room, listening for any voices, any hints, but she was nowhere. The hostess, Wendy, was my next stop. When I asked if she'd seen Tracy, she casually said, "She and Charles went to his car to check something." The words hit like a slap. His car? Trying not to let my irritation show, I asked, "What kind of car does he drive?" Wendy's expression shifted as she registered my tone. "A gray Saab," she answered softly. That was all I needed to hear. Stepping out onto the street, I looked for the Saab, but it was nowhere in sight. The college was just 5 minutes away, so I got in my truck and drove through every lot on campus, scanning for the car. Nothing. I called Tracy's phone, but it went straight to voicemail.
Once. Twice.
4 times. By midnight, I was sitting in our empty living room, staring at the black screen of the TV. Images of Tracy and Charles replayed in my mind like a cruel movie I couldn't turn off. For hours, I sat in that chair, caught between disbelief and anger, waiting for her to come home. By 3 a.m., the thought occurred to me that maybe they'd been in a car accident. It was absurd, but desperation does strange things. I called the sheriff's office to check. No accidents reported. Tracy's phone remained silent. I left more messages, each one angrier and more broken than the last. It wasn't until noon the next day that I heard her car pull into the driveway. I stayed in the living room, a hollow shell of anger and dread. Tracy walked in, holding her keys, and sat quietly on the sofa across from me. There was no apology.
No explanation.
Her blonde hair, damp and tied back into a ponytail, contrasted sharply with her sun-kissed skin, flushed and glowing. She looked stunning, like someone who'd had a perfect night. The smug, almost serene expression on her face shattered any doubts I had. There was no hiding the truth. The silence between us was thick. I finally asked her where she'd been. Her answer was calm, eerily so, as if she had been rehearsing it. She spoke about a connection she couldn't explain, a feeling that was electric and unlike anything she'd experienced before. She described it as though it were some divine, unavoidable force, and as though I, her husband of 25 years, should understand. But I didn't. I couldn't. She said she loved me, but she was in love with Charles. The words felt like poison. Tracy, the woman I'd given decades of my life to, sat there talking about another man as if the last 25 years meant nothing. She sobbed as though that would soften the blow, but it only fueled my anger. Love?
Connection?
The excuses sounded like the ramblings of someone who had been swept up in a fairy tale, forgetting the life she'd built in the process. I didn't hold back. I told her it was over. She didn't get to have me as a backup while chasing this ridiculous fantasy. If she was in love with him, she could go be with him. Whatever she felt that night in Charles's presence, it had destroyed everything we had built. As far as I was concerned, the marriage ended the moment she chose him. I watched her for any flicker of regret, something to indicate she'd made a mistake, but all I saw was resignation, like she had already moved on. The house, once our shared space, suddenly felt unfamiliar. The walls echoed with silence. Tracy left the room without another word, and I sat there alone, my mind spinning as I tried to process the unraveling of everything I thought I knew. When I arrived, the party was in full swing. Kids were running around, the grill was fired up, and the sounds of cheerful chatter filled the air. I grabbed a beer and made my rounds, catching up with old neighbors and some friends. I spotted Tracy and Charles on the other side of the yard, holding court with their usual air of importance. Charles had his arm around Tracy, who seemed to be putting on a smile far too forced for my liking. I couldn't help but notice the exhaustion etched on her face. Something had clearly changed. At one point, Tracy and I inevitably crossed paths. She was holding little Charles Jr. on her hip, bouncing him gently while looking distracted. I gave her a polite nod as we passed each other. "Greg," she said, stopping me. I turned and offered her a neutral smile. "Hey, Tracy." For the first time in years, there was no smugness, no condescension in her tone. Just a quiet sort of resignation. "You look good," she added softly, glancing at me. "Thanks," I replied. "You too." It wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't meant to hurt her either. Little Charles squirmed in her arms, and she sighed, clearly overwhelmed. "It's been hard lately," she muttered, almost to herself. I raised an eyebrow, but didn't press her for details. It wasn't my problem anymore. "I'm sure it has," I said simply. "But you made your choice." Her eyes flickered to mine, and for a brief moment, I saw it. That sadness, that regret she never allowed herself to show. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but Charles walked up at that exact moment, beer in hand, and his usual smug grin plastered on his face. "Ready to go, Trace?" he asked, clearly dismissing me with a glance. She hesitated before nodding, giving me one last look before turning and walking away with her dream guy. That moment cemented something for me. Tracy wasn't the same woman I'd married. Whatever she'd been chasing, whether it was the thunderbolt, passion, or some fantasy of a perfect life, it hadn't brought her happiness. And while part of me could have felt vindicated, I didn't. I just felt free. As the sun set on that party, I found myself laughing with a few friends, genuinely enjoying myself in a way I hadn't in years. For so long, I had allowed Tracy's betrayal to define me, to make me question my worth and everything I believed in. But standing there, surrounded by good people and good conversation, I realized I was finally done carrying that weight. I wasn't Greg, the abandoned husband. I was Greg, just Greg.
And that was enough.
In the weeks that followed, I started saying yes to more things. Scott convinced me to join their community softball team, and Wendy's friend Jane, one of her more successful setups, became someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. And that was more than enough. As for Tracy, I don't know how her story ended, and honestly, I don't care to. She made her choices, and I made mine. Whatever thunderbolt she felt had come and gone, but my life was just beginning to feel electric in its own quiet, steady way. And that's the kind of peace I wouldn't trade for anything. The backyard was alive with laughter, music, and the clinking of drinks, a familiar setting for the Harrises' annual summer party. This year was different, though. I knew Tracy and Charles would be there. Wendy and Scott, always feeling a little guilty about how Tracy had met Charles at their party 3 years ago, warned me ahead of time. But I reassured them I wasn't the same man I had been back then. I wouldn't let their presence ruin my evening. I'd been at the party for a couple of hours before I saw them walk in together. Tracy looked better than the last time I'd seen her. She'd shed some of the pregnancy weight and carried herself with a bit more confidence, but something about her had changed. The glow that used to accompany her bright blue eyes was gone. Even her smile, though perfectly executed, lacked the light it once held. It was as though the years had chipped away at her, leaving only an empty version of the woman I had once loved. I decided to take control of the situation early. I approached her and Charles, gave her a light hug, and shook Charles's hand with a calm cordiality I didn't know I possessed. Tracy looked surprised, maybe even a little relieved, while Charles seemed wary but said nothing. We exchanged small talk, nothing more than pleasantries, and I excused myself after a minute or two, retreating back to my group of friends near the grill. I could see Wendy watching me nervously from across the yard, visibly exhaling as I walked away without incident. A while later, the sand volleyball game started. It was a staple at these gatherings, and I wasn't going to miss out. The winner's court was a place of pride, and I joined a team as we dove headfirst into the match. We played 2 games, and though I gave it my all, we lost the second, meaning we had to sit out for a while. Sweaty and tired, I grabbed a beer and scanned the yard. That's when I saw Tracy again. She was sitting alone on a lawn chair, watching the games with a distant look on her face.
Charles was nowhere to be seen.
Something about the scene unsettled me. Maybe it was the loneliness in her expression or the fact that Tracy sitting alone at a party was uncharacteristic. My instincts kicked in, ones I had learned to trust over the last few years. I didn't make a show of it, but I walked casually back inside the house, beer in hand, deciding to take a look around. I wasn't actively seeking trouble. I just wanted to satisfy my gut feeling. It didn't take long to find what I wasn't really looking for. I walked into the den, and there was Charles. His arm was draped around Marilyn Jansen's waist as they stood close together, laughing with a small group of people. Marilyn wasn't just any woman. She was married to Troy Jansen, a guy I knew well. The way Marilyn was looking at Charles, with open admiration and a touch of desire, left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't innocent. For a second, I thought about turning around and pretending I hadn't seen anything. After all, it wasn't my business. Tracy wasn't my wife anymore, and I had no obligation to tell her what her dream man was up to. But before I could leave, fate intervened. Troy walked in behind me, heading into the den to find me and talk strategy for the next volleyball game. It didn't take him more than a second to see what I had. His eyes narrowed, his face contorted with anger, and he shouted, "You jerk! Get your hands off my wife!" Troy lunged forward before I could stop him. Charles tried to pull away, his usual arrogant demeanor replaced with a look of alarm, but it was too late. Troy grabbed Charles's arm, pushing him back as Marilyn tried unsuccessfully to defuse the situation. Voices rose, furniture scraped against the floor, and before things could escalate any further, someone called the cops. I didn't intervene. I wasn't about to get in the middle of someone else's mess. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers stepping into the den as the chaos settled into awkward silence. One was Sergeant Jim Hill, a gruff older man with the demeanor of someone who'd seen it all. The other was Officer Kathleen MacDonald, a tall, striking woman with long red hair, bright green eyes, and the unmistakable freckles of her Irish heritage. While Sergeant Hill handled Troy and Charles, Officer MacDonald began taking statements from the other witnesses. When it was my turn, I walked over to her side of the room, careful not to look too smug as Charles sat nearby, still seething. I explained what I had seen. Charles with his arm around Marilyn, their body language leaving little to the imagination, and ended with a casual remark. "You know, he's the guy who stole my wife at this same party 3 years ago." Officer MacDonald gave me a look, half curious, half incredulous, before asking, "And you're still going to take her to the hospital for him? Are you that nice, or just a complete idiot?" I paused, momentarily thrown by her bluntness, but couldn't help chuckling at her attempt to hide a smile. "Definitely a complete idiot," I replied with a grin. Her laughter broke through for a moment, and I found myself appreciating the sound. It was warm, genuine, something I hadn't experienced in years. After a few more questions, she handed me a card.
"Here.
"Call me if you remember anything else," she said, before scribbling what I was fairly certain was her personal number on the back. By the time the scene settled and the police left, Tracy was in tears. I found her sitting on the front steps, her face in her hands. She looked up when I approached, her eyes red and tired. "Charles is gone," she whispered. "Yeah," I replied softly. "And he was about to leave with someone else tonight." She looked at me, disbelieving, but I didn't waver. "Charles shouldn't have been getting handsy with Marilyn Jansen," I added. "Maybe if I'd been that assertive 3 years ago, you and I might still be together." Tracy flinched at my words, and for the first time in a long time, I saw real regret in her expression. Neither of us said another word as I dropped her off at the ER later that night. When I got home, I pulled Kathleen MacDonald's card from my pocket and stared at the number for a long moment. After everything that had happened, I wasn't expecting to feel hope. Yet, as I thought about her teasing tone, her quick wit, and the laughter that had broken through the tension, I realized maybe the story wasn't over for me. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to turn the page. 3 days later, I dialed her number. "About time," she said when she picked up, her voice laced with humor. "I was starting to think I scared you off." "You're not getting rid of me that easily," I replied, smiling to myself. Time has a funny way of healing wounds while leaving the scars as reminders. Years passed after the summer party that upended everything, and my life took a direction I never could have predicted. But before I get ahead of myself, let me tell you how it all wrapped up. After my first dinner with Kathleen MacDonald, that sharp-witted, flame-haired officer, something changed for me. She was unlike anyone I had met in years, a woman who asked questions that made me think, really think, and who listened with an open, probing curiosity. It wasn't about prying, it was about understanding. After that evening at the Greek restaurant, she left me standing on her doorstep with a kiss on the cheek, a simple gesture that somehow turned my insides into knots. I felt like a teenager again, replaying the moment over and over as I drove home, her soft lips, her faint scent of white shoulder perfume lingering in my memory. The next morning, she surprised me by calling to ask if I wanted to join her for bagels and lox at her place. I didn't hesitate for a second. That Sunday morning, sitting across her kitchen table, I realized I hadn't felt so comfortable, so at ease, in a very long time. It was the first of many breakfasts, conversations, and shared moments that made me feel alive again. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood didn't slow down. Scott and Wendy Harris invited me over for dinner one night to clear the air, still apologizing for everything that had happened at their infamous party. Over drinks, Scott vented about Charles, who was now threatening to sue him and Troy Jansen for what had gone down with Marilyn. "That guy must think he's God's gift to women," Scott grumbled, shaking his head. Wendy, however, couldn't help herself. "Well, he is charming," she admitted, before Scott shot her a glare that could melt steel. Troy, as it turned out, spent a miserable weekend in jail after the fight, while Marilyn disappeared with their kids to her mother's house in another town. Their marriage, unsurprisingly, unraveled. "You're not alone, man," I told Scott, offering to talk to Troy and help him through it. I knew exactly what it felt like to have your world turned upside down by betrayal. But things took a turn no one saw coming. Months later, Wendy began to show. At first, whispers circulated, but when Scott called me in a fit of fury, the truth came out. "Can you believe this?" He practically shouted into the phone. "That jerk got my wife pregnant." Charles once again had struck. Wendy admitted to a long-standing affair that had started at the party a year prior. She and Charles had been sneaking off, thinking a weekend at a motel without protection couldn't hurt. Scott was devastated, his voice hollow as he added, "I asked for your lawyer's number. Can I get a friends and family discount?" For Charles, it seemed everything unraveled too. He and Wendy moved into an apartment near the campus, leaving Tracy and CJ, the son they'd had together, on their own. Tracy, now a single mom at nearly 50, found herself struggling, and it didn't take long before I bumped into her again. It happened one afternoon at McDonald's, of all places. I was eating lunch when Tracy appeared, holding CJ's tiny hand as they approached my table. She looked older, not just physically, but as if life had weathered her. CJ, though, was a bright spot. "Hi, Greg," she said softly as they sat across from me. CJ extended his little hand with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "Hello, sir," he said, his voice deliberate. I shook his hand firmly, genuinely impressed. "He's growing fast," I remarked to Tracy, trying to keep things light. She nodded, but her face said something else entirely. A mix of sadness and hesitation sat behind her tired eyes. It wasn't long before she blurted out the question that had clearly been weighing on her. "Did you ever really love me, Greg? As much as you claimed? If you did, why didn't you fight for me?" Her voice wavered as CJ unwrapped his cheeseburger beside us. "Why didn't you ask me to come back? Or check on me and CJ? Why didn't you try?" I blinked, stunned. This was her narrative, that I was somehow at fault for not fighting harder to save us. I took a deep breath and steadied myself, my words firm but calm. "Tracy, this wasn't my fault. I trusted you. Trusted us completely. When I pulled Charles's hand off your waist, you looked me in the eyes and insisted nothing was happening. I believed you. That's what you do when you love someone. You trust them. I had no reason to fight, because you made it clear where you stood. By the time you came home the next day, the damage was done." Her expression faltered, but I pressed on. "You broke our vows. You gave yourself to him, and then you told me, so casually, that it was the best connection you'd ever felt. What was I supposed to do? Beg? You didn't want me anymore. You chose him." For a moment, silence hung between us. CJ played with his fries, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. Then Tracy, her voice softer now, said, "So this is all my fault." "It's not about blame anymore," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "But I'm not going to pretend I didn't love you. I did. Deeply. But you shattered my heart so completely that I had to let you go. And when you chose to have his child, after refusing me a second one for 25 years, I knew there was nothing left for me to hold on to." She said nothing, though her face reflected a kind of quiet understanding. For once, she didn't argue. As the years went on, our lives diverged completely. I married Kathleen McDonald 2 years later, and together we built a life I hadn't dared to hope for. We co-founded a cybersecurity firm, blending her sharp intuition with my technical expertise, and we became inseparable, in business and in life. Kathleen brought light and laughter into my days, and I fell a little more in love with her every year. Between us, we now have 5 grandchildren. Some live in Denver, others in Houston, but we manage to visit them all regularly. Life is good. Fulfilling. Tracy still lives in town, raising CJ, who's now a teenager. To my knowledge, she never remarried. Morgan, our daughter, keeps me updated occasionally, mentioning that Tracy's life seems difficult and that Charles had to be forced to pay child support. In the end, Tracy made her choices and I made mine. The chapter we shared is closed, but I've learned that life, real life, isn't defined by its painful moments. It's about what comes after, the parts where you rebuild, find happiness, and move forward. For me, that's exactly what I did.